Hey everyone, the question I commonly get is what is the difference between Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop? And when should I use which? The truth of the matter is, for most organizations, it's a both and, not an either or. But in general, I'm going to cut right to it. If you want to deliver a single session desktop, use Windows 365 right here. If you want to deliver multi-session or app streaming, use Azure Virtual Desktop right here. And let me explain to you the reason why. And let me start by explaining to you what Azure Virtual Desktop multi-session is. Historically, on Windows Server, you could deliver multiple sessions to your end users that they had access to using shared resources on the back end. And then once Azure Virtual Desktop came out for the first time ever, you could do that with Windows 10 or Windows 11. So the problem with doing it with Windows Server, where there were some apps that weren't compatible with Windows Server, even Microsoft by design had developed some of their own mainstream productivity applications not to be used on Windows Server. So Windows 10 and Windows 11 in multi-session opened up a whole new world for multi-session. And basically what that means is if I take, for instance, I have a VM in Azure, maybe my D series where I have an 8 by 32 gigabytes of RAM, 8 virtual CPU VM, I can stack in what we consider a heavy use case. I can stack 2 users per virtual core. So that means on one 8 by 32 D series VM, I could get 16 users on that. And so a pretty heavy Office user. Um, we could stack 16 users per virtual machine. So you can immediately see the cost savings. Whereas if I was going to do that on single session with a dedicated VM, say I need a 2 by 8 per se virtual machine for every one of those individual 16 users. So I need this times 16. And then on top of that, with the Azure Virtual Desktop, you could have your VMs scale out as more users join. You could tell it, once I have 10 users, spin up another virtual machine. And once I have, another 26, spin up another, and so on and so forth. You can set rules for scaling up and then scaling back down as needed. And so that's the power of multi-session. So what are use cases where you'd use multi-session? Well, typically it's where everybody has the same environment that they're using. So think of a call center where they all have the exact same applications. Think of maybe a finance team where they're all accessing the same tools, because you can spit out that same image to each one. Now you can do app masking and get a more individualized experience that way. But in generally speaking, the use case is where you have a bunch of the same type of users, and you can use the shared resources on the back end and spit out the same environment to them all. They'll all have their own individual session, but they're using those shared resources on the back end. The cost savings are just phenomenal. I'll show you pricing here at the end, but multi-session is a classic Azure Virtual Desktop solution. The other solution that's classic Azure Virtual Desktop is just app streaming. So you can only do that on AVD, so app streaming. And that's where you just deliver an individual app to your end user. So look right here, like where they're delivering just Excel or the browser or any application that you want there in the screenshot. So the other place, the other thing you should know about app streaming is that you can now license individual users. I think it's about $5.50 per application per user if you need to have a use case where you're going to license external users to access an individual application. So that opens up some neat possibilities. But Windows 365, the reason that you use this in single session and not Azure Virtual Desktop is 2 reasons. Number one, this is desktop as a service. So you get the full experience as a service, and you don't have to do anything. You can use Intune or Endpoint Manager to distribute it out. You select the box you want for that single session user. You pay a monthly rate, and that's it. And so it's a very clean. It takes no VDI experience to spin it up and running to run it. And so it's just an incredible benefit. With both of these scenarios, if you have Microsoft 365 or you have Windows 10 E3, you have a sunk cost into all of this. For the Azure Virtual Desktop environment, when you have that licensing and you're delivering Windows 10 or 11 to your end users, there's no Windows licensing, there's no cost of the control plane. You're paying that bare bones compute cost and then some storage and networking pieces as well. With Windows 365, it's very similar, except for you're paying just this monthly rate for the individual box. And so the reason number one is it's desktop as a service, but reason number two is this, they've priced the single session scenario for Windows 365 to actually be cheaper than a single session scenario with Azure Virtual Desktop. So I'm going to show you this below here on my screen. And I'm going to zoom in here. This comes from Nerdio, which is one of our Azure Virtual Desktop value add partners. They put this pricing comparison together. And what I want you to notice on here is Windows 365 cost is cheaper than a single session user on Azure Virtual Desktop, even with reservations. And so there's Windows 365 is what you want to use in single session, especially considering that you don't have to manage anything. The Azure Virtual Desktop is a PaaS service. You can do it all in our portal. It's really cool. There's lots of stuff you can do, but it takes more work to set up and to manage. And so, although it is definitely platform as a service, so you're not doing everything. We do a lot of the pieces for you as well. Where you can see that the pricing changes here, and Azure Virtual Desktop becomes cheaper is where it says pooled users. So once you get into the pooled category, that's where you want to look at Azure Virtual Desktop, or for app streaming, obviously. But AVD, multi-session or pooled desktops is where that price really drops down. And so now the advanced auto scaling, I should give a shout out to Nerdio here. They're the best at it still, and they still have a very streamlined scenario for setting up AVD. So if you want some help with that, Nerdio is a great solution for that. But nevertheless, those are the two use cases that you want to look at: single session, Windows 365, multi-session, Azure Virtual Desktop, or app streaming is Azure Virtual Desktop. Let us know if you have questions. We have lots of funding programs, partners, workshops, all kinds of ways that we can support if you're looking at exploring either one of these scenarios. I know my Modern Workplace team on the Windows 365 side has some promos going to the end of the year. So just let us know. We'd love to dive into the weeds with you. There are some gotchas in some of the scenarios I have with highly detailed, technical specifications where you might have to use one or the other type of scenario. So we're happy to go as deep as need to be on an individual one-off conversation as well. But thanks for checking out this video, and let me know if it was helpful.